The Nevada desert stretched endlessly around the abandoned cabin, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring into the wasteland. Rowena Harrison pulled her truck to a stop, dust swirling in the scorching heat. 6 months ago, she'd been a respected member of her Mormon community. Now she was nothing, excommunicated, shunned, invisible. The cabin belonged to her great-aunt Sarah, a woman the family never spoke about, a woman who'd also been cast out decades ago. Rowena gripped the rusted key in her palm, wondering if this broken-down shack was all that remained of her future. But as she stepped inside the rotting structure, her construction background kicked in. Beneath years of neglect, she could see good bones, solid foundation. What she couldn't see yet was the hidden room behind the kitchen wall or the journals stacked inside it. Journals that would reveal why Great-Aunt Sarah was really banished. Journals that contained evidence of something the church elders would kill to keep buried. What miracle was Sarah hiding that cost her everything? The floorboards creaked beneath Rowena's boots as she surveyed the interior. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, casting dusty beams across overturned furniture and debris. The air hung thick with decades of abandonment. Yet something about this place felt oddly welcoming, more welcoming than her own childhood home had felt after the tribunal. She remembered that day with crystal clarity. The bishop's cold eyes, the council of 12 men who'd stripped away her membership like peeling paint from wood, all because she'd asked the wrong questions, all because she'd dared to research church history beyond the sanitized versions they fed to Sunday school classes. "Sister Harrison," the bishop had said, his voice echoing off the chapel walls, "your persistent sharing of anti-Mormon literature and your refusal to sustain the brethren leaves us no choice." Anti-Mormon literature. That's what they called historical documents. That's what they called her quest for truth. Now, standing in Sarah's forgotten refuge, Rowena pulled out her phone and scrolled through the dozens of missed calls from her parents, her siblings, her former friends. They'd all chosen the church over her. The community had closed ranks, and she'd become a ghost in her own hometown. A sound made her freeze, a soft scratching from somewhere within the walls. Desert mice, probably. Or worse, she'd need to clear them out before any serious renovation could begin. Rowena set her duffel bag on the least damaged chair and began walking through each room, mentally cataloguing what needed attention. The roof required immediate patching. The plumbing would need complete replacement. The electrical system looked like a fire hazard from the 1940s, but the foundation was solid, just as she'd sensed. Someone had built this place to last. In the kitchen, she ran her hand along the wall that separated it from what appeared to be a storage closet. The texture felt different here, newer wood that didn't quite match the rest. Her contractor's instincts prickled. Renovation work, done decades ago by someone who knew what they were doing but tried to hide it. She'd investigate that later. First, she needed to make the place livable enough for one night. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Rowena hauled her camping supplies inside. She'd brought everything necessary to rough it for a few weeks. Sleeping bag, camp stove, lantern, and enough canned goods to survive while she figured out her next move. The lawyer who'd contacted her about Sarah's inheritance had been puzzled by the bequest. "Frankly, Miss Harrison, I'm surprised she left this to you. From what I understand, your family had cut all ties with Sarah Harrison Miller decades ago." Harrison Miller. Sarah had married someone the family disapproved of. Another strike against her. Rowena lit her camping lantern as darkness settled over the desert. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, a wild sound that should have felt threatening but somehow didn't. She'd grown up in Utah suburbs, surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and neighbors who watched each other's every move. This isolation felt like freedom. She heated a can of soup on her camp stove and tried to imagine Sarah living here, cut off from everyone she'd once known. Had she been lonely, bitter, or had she found peace in this stark landscape? Tomorrow, Rowena would drive into the nearest town for supplies and start the real work. Tonight, she'd simply exist in this space that Sarah had claimed as her own. As she settled into her sleeping bag, A thought struck her. The inheritance paperwork had mentioned personal effects, but she'd seen nothing like that in her initial survey. No photographs, no books, no clothes. Either someone had cleared the place out, or Sarah had hidden her most precious possessions. The scratching sound came again, definitely from the kitchen wall. Rowena smiled grimly. Tomorrow she'd investigate that suspicious wall section. Whatever secrets Great-Aunt Sarah had left behind, Rowena intended to find them. After all, she had nothing left to lose. The key turned easier than Rowena expected, as if the desert air had somehow preserved the old mechanisms better than time should have allowed. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo across the empty landscape behind her. Dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon light that cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene frozen in time. Her great-aunt Miriam had been gone for 3 years, but the cabin felt like it had been waiting much longer. Furniture sat draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts, and the air carried the scent of sage and something else, something sweet and indefinable that made Rowena's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She dropped her single suitcase by the door and pulled out her phone, hoping for even one bar of service. Nothing. The isolation was complete now, just as she'd wanted when she'd driven here in desperation 2 days after the church elders had made their final pronouncement. Shunned was such an old-fashioned word, but it carried the weight of centuries. Her parents wouldn't meet her eyes. Her siblings had been instructed to treat her as if she'd never existed. 26 years of life, erased with a few signatures on official church documents. The questions had started innocently enough. Why were certain historical documents kept from members? Why couldn't she find any archaeological evidence for the civilizations described in their sacred texts? But innocent questions, she'd learned, could be the most dangerous kind. Rowena moved deeper into the cabin, her footsteps muffled by a layer of dust on the hardwood floors. She pulled away the first sheet, revealing a rocking chair worn smooth by use. The next sheet covered a small dining table with 2 chairs, as if Miriam had been expecting company that never came, or perhaps she had simply hoped. In the kitchen, mason jars lined open shelves, filled with preserved fruits and vegetables that should have spoiled years ago, but somehow looked as fresh as if they'd been canned yesterday. Rowena picked up 1 jar of peaches, turning it in the fading light. The label was written in Miriam's careful script, Summer's Blessing, 1987, 35 years old. Impossible. She set the jar down quickly, as if it had burned her fingers. Stress and grief could make a person see things that weren't there. She'd been driving for 18 hours straight, living on gas station coffee and the kind of despair that made everything seem surreal. The living room held more mysteries. Photographs covered the mantelpiece, but they weren't the typical family portraits she expected. Instead, they showed the desert landscape through different seasons, the same view she could see from the front window, but captured over what appeared to be decades. In some photos, the landscape looked familiar. In others, the very shape of the distant mountains seemed different, as if the earth itself had been rearranged. One photograph made her stop breathing. It showed a garden in full bloom where she had seen only scrub brush and sand when she'd arrived. The image was dated just 2 months ago. Rowena sank into the rocking chair, the wood creaking under her weight with a sound that was almost musical. The chair seemed to fit her perfectly, as if it had been waiting for someone exactly her size. She closed her eyes and let herself rock, feeling truly still for the first time since her world had collapsed. When she opened her eyes again, the light had changed. What she had initially taken for late afternoon sun was now clearly evening, but somehow the cabin felt brighter rather than darker. A warm glow seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, though she couldn't identify its source. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since dawn. She returned to the kitchen and examined the preserved foods more carefully. Each jar bore a date from decades past, yet the contents looked impossibly fresh. Her rational mind rejected what her eyes were telling her, but her empty stomach was less philosophical. She selected a jar of what looked like vegetable soup, dated 1992. The lid opened with a satisfying pop, releasing an aroma so rich and appealing that her mouth watered immediately. she found a pot on the stove, an old gas range that somehow lit on the first try despite having no visible gas line connected to it. As the soup heated, Rowena explored the rest of the cabin. The bedroom was sparse but comfortable, with a quilt that felt hand-stitched and a window that looked out toward the mountains. But it was the small room at the back of the cabin that made her breath catch. The walls were covered with journals, hundreds of them, stretching back decades. Each was labeled with dates and filled with Miriam's careful handwriting. But it wasn't just the quantity that stunned her, it was the organization. The journals were arranged by subject, weather patterns and their intentions, the language of growing things, visitors from the deep desert, and most intriguingly, the church's lost doctrine, what they chose to forget. Rowena pulled that last journal from the shelf with trembling hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Rowena pulled her battered Honda into the dirt clearing that served as a driveway. The cabin looked even more desolate in daylight. Weathered wooden siding the color of old bones, a sagging front porch, and windows so grimy they reflected nothing but her own uncertainty back at her. She sat in the car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and wondered what great-aunt Miriam had been thinking when she'd left this place to someone she'd barely known. The will had been specific, to my great-niece Rowena, who understands what it means to be cast out for asking questions. Even from the grave, Miriam seemed to know things she shouldn't. The key was exactly where the lawyer had said it would be, under the third loose board on the porch steps. As Rowena lifted the plank, something scurried away into the shadows beneath. She tried not to think about what kind of creatures had made this place their home over the years. The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that slanted through the dirty windows. The cabin was sparse but not empty. A small kitchen with chipped linoleum counters, a living area with a stone fireplace, 2 bedrooms barely large enough for single beds. Everything covered in a fine layer of desert dust and the particular silence of abandonment. Rowena set her single suitcase down and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the vast expanse of scrubland that stretched to distant purple mountains. This was freedom, she told herself. This was what she'd chosen when she'd stood up in Sunday service and asked why God would command Abraham to sacrifice Isaac if he knew he would stop him. Why test faith through cruelty? The question had been sincere, born from weeks of struggling with doubts she could no longer silence. The response had been swift and final. Her bishop's face had turned the color of old brick. Her parents had refused to meet her eyes. Within a week she'd been formally shunned, cut off from everyone and everything she'd ever known. The community that had raised her, fed her, shaped every aspect of her identity had simply erased her. She opened a kitchen cabinet and found it mostly empty, except for a few mismatched dishes and a manila envelope propped against the back wall. Her name was written across it in spidery handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside were 3 things that made her hands shake: a photograph, a handwritten letter, and a small brass key. The photograph showed 2 women standing in front of this very cabin, but it looked different, well-maintained, with flowers blooming in window boxes and fresh paint gleaming white in the sun. One woman was clearly Miriam, though decades younger, her dark hair in the simple style Rowena remembered from childhood glimpses at family gatherings. The other woman was a stranger, blonde and laughing, wearing a dress that seemed too elegant for the desert setting. The letter was brief but cryptic, Rowena. If you're reading this, then you've found your way here as I hoped you would. The questions that drove you away are the same ones that brought me to this place 50 years ago. Some truths are too dangerous for communities built on certainty. The basement door is behind the bookshelf in the main room. Use the key when you're ready to understand why I never returned to the church and why I waited so long to reach out to you. Be careful who you trust with what you find. Miriam. Rowena read the letter 3 times, her pulse quickening with each pass. She'd never known that Miriam had left the church. Family law painted her as an eccentric old woman who'd chosen solitude over society, but there had never been any mention of religious differences or some kind of falling out. The bookshelf in the living room was small and dusty, filled with an odd collection of titles, some religious texts she recognized, but also books on archaeology, ancient history, and what appeared to be academic papers on Mormon doctrine and early church history. When she pressed against the right side of the shelf, it swung inward like a door, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and dry, carrying a scent that reminded her of museums and old libraries. She found a flashlight in one of the kitchen drawers and tested it, relieved when it produced a strong beam. Standing at the top of those stairs, brass key warm in her palm, Rowena felt the weight of choice. She could close the bookshelf, pack her car, and drive back to Salt Lake City, find some way to rebuild a normal life, maybe even reconcile with her family eventually. Or she could descend into whatever truth had consumed Miriam, enough to live in exile for half a century. The desert wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the empty sky. Rowena took her first step down into the darkness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's interior as Rowena knelt beside the loose floorboard, her fingers tracing the edges where the wood had warped with age. She'd spent the night tossing on the narrow cot, unable to shake the feeling that the house itself was trying to tell her something. The board lifted easily, revealing a hollow space beneath. Her heart hammered as she reached inside, expecting to find nothing but dust and maybe a few old coins. Instead, her fingers brushed against something wrapped in oiled cloth. She pulled out a bundle, surprisingly heavy for its size. The cloth fell away to reveal a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. A letter was tucked inside the front cover, the envelope yellowed with age but still sealed. Her name was written across it in spidery handwriting she didn't recognize. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was brittle, threatening to crumble at her touch. My dear Rowena, if you are reading this, then you have come home at last. I have been waiting for you, though I suspect I will be long gone when you finally arrive. There are things you need to know about your family, about this place, and about yourself. Your great-great-grandmother Sarah wasn't just a woman who left the church. She was a woman who discovered something the church fathers wanted buried, something they've spent generations trying to erase. The answers are in this journal. But be warned, once you know the truth, there will be no going back. They will come for you just as they came for her, just as they came for your mother. Trust no one from the old community. Trust your instincts, and remember, miracles aren't always what they seem. Your loving Aunt Miriam. Rowena stared at the signature. Aunt Miriam? She'd never heard of any Aunt Miriam. Her parents had claimed their family history was simple, traceable, documented in the church records. But this letter suggested something else entirely. She opened the journal carefully, its leather binding creaking with age. The first page was dated 1847, written in a bold, clear hand. Today we arrived in the valley. Brother Brigham says this is our promised land, our Zion. But I have seen things on this journey that trouble my soul. The visions that came to me in the wilderness were not the same as those spoken of in our meetings. The voice I heard spoke of deception, of truth hidden beneath layers of man's invention. Rowena's breath caught. This was her ancestors' first-hand account of the Mormon pioneers' journey west. But these weren't the sanitized stories she'd grown up hearing in Sunday school. She flipped through more pages, scanning entries that spoke of secret meetings, of women gathering in hidden places to share their own revelations. Sarah had documented everything, names, dates, locations of what appeared to be an underground network of believers who questioned the official doctrine. A passage near the middle of the journal made her stop cold. The gift runs in bloodlines, as I suspected. Young Rebecca, my granddaughter, showed signs today. She knew of Brother Thompson's death before the messenger arrived. She spoke of seeing him in a vision, standing in a field of light, warning her of darkness coming to our people. The elders would call this blasphemy, a woman receiving revelation independently of their authority. but I know what I've seen in my own visions. The truth is larger than their narrow doctrine." Rowena's hands shook. The gift. What gift? She thought of her own childhood, of the dreams that had seemed too real, of knowing things she shouldn't have known. Her parents had dismissed these as childish imagination, had taught her to pray for such distractions to be taken away. A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. She clutched the journal to her chest, her heart racing. The letter's warning echoed in her mind. Trust no one from the old community. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. A shadow moved across the gap beneath the door frame. Whoever it was wasn't knocking, wasn't announcing themselves. They were listening, waiting. Rowena crept to the window and peered through a crack in the boards she'd used to cover it. A man in a dark suit stood on her porch, his back to her. Something about his posture was familiar, but she couldn't place him from this angle. He turned slightly, and her blood went cold. Elder Morrison, one of the church's highest-ranking officials in their region, the same man who had sat in judgment during her excommunication. What was he doing here? How had he even known where to find her? The man reached into his jacket and pulled out what looked like a cell phone, though he held it strangely, as if it was something else entirely. He raised it toward the cabin, moving it in a slow sweep from left to right. Some kind of detector? Scanner? Rowena's mind raced. Were they tracking her somehow, or were they looking for something specific, something like the journal now hidden in her arms? Elder Morrison pocketed the device and walked to the edge of the porch, studying the ground around the cabin with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Rowena made her way back to the cabin, the leather-bound journal tucked securely under her arm. She'd spent the night in her car after her confrontation with Bishop Garrett, unable to face returning to her apartment, knowing her former community would soon learn of her complete fall from grace. The journal felt heavier than its physical weight suggested. Each page she glimpsed contained her great-aunt's careful handwriting, documenting something that defied everything Rowena had been taught about their family history. According to the church records, Miriam Blackwood had died childless and faithful, yet here was evidence of a different story entirely. Inside the cabin, Rowena settled into the rickety chair by the window and opened the journal to its first entry, dated 3 months before Miriam's supposed death. "They've found us again. I can see the dust clouds from their horses on the horizon. Sarah's fever broke this morning, but she's still too weak to travel. The other women are frightened, and I don't blame them. Brother Jacobson's men have been relentless in their pursuit. He cannot accept that we've chosen a different path." Rowena's hands trembled as she turned the page. Brother Jacobson. She knew that name from family stories. He'd been one of the early church leaders, praised for his dedication to rooting out apostates and polygamists who brought shame to the community. "Today I performed the laying on of hands for Sister Catherine's daughter. The child had been born with a twisted spine, pronounced incurable by the doctors in Salt Lake City, but the gift that flows through me, this power I've been blessed with, it straightened her bones as surely as the Lord straightened the trees after the great wind." Catherine wept with joy, but I cautioned her to speak of this to no one outside our circle. There are those who would call such things witchcraft rather than recognize them as God's true gifts. The entries continued, each one more startling than the last. Miriam wrote of healing the blind, of calling rain during drought, of dreams that revealed the locations of lost children. But more troubling were her descriptions of the growing persecution from church leadership. "Brother Jacobson arrived today with 12 men. They demand I return to submit to church discipline for my unnatural practices. When I refused, he declared me and my followers to be in league with Satan. How can they not see that these gifts come from the same source as those claimed by our prophets? Is it only because I am a woman that they fear what the Lord has given me?" Rowena set the journal down, her mind reeling. In all her years of faithful attendance, she'd never heard whispers of women claiming prophetic gifts. The church taught that such authority was reserved for men, passed down through proper priesthood channels. Yet here was her great-aunt, apparently wielding power that rivaled the stories of biblical miracles. A knock at the cabin door made her jump. Through the grimy window, she saw a figure silhouetted against the bright morning light, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the crisp white shirt and dark pants that marked him as one of the church authorities. Her heart sank as she recognized Elder Morrison, one of Bishop Garrett's most trusted assistants. She considered not answering, but the man had clearly seen her car outside. "Sister Blackwood," Morrison called through the door. "I know you're in there. The bishop sent me to speak with you." Reluctantly, Rowena tucked the journal under a pile of old newspapers and opened the door. Morrison's usual friendly demeanor was replaced by stern disapproval. "You've caused quite a stir," he said, stepping inside without invitation. "Brother Garrett is concerned about your spiritual welfare. He's asked me to extend one final offer of redemption." "And what would that require?" Rowena asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "A public confession before the congregation this Sunday. Acknowledgement of your transgressions and a commitment to abandon these dangerous questions you've been asking. In return, you'll be placed on probation rather than facing complete excommunication." Morrison's eyes wandered around the cabin, taking in its shabby condition. "This place should have been torn down years ago," he muttered. "Your great-aunt was troubled toward the end. We've always suspected she hid things out here that would be better destroyed." The casual way he spoke of Miriam sent a flash of anger through Rowena. Troubled how? She made claims, wild stories about visions and healings that had no basis in proper doctrine. The bishop at the time was forced to take action. Morrison's gaze sharpened. "I hope you haven't found any of her old writings. Such things can poison a mind that's already wavering in faith." Rowena forced her expression to remain neutral. "I'm just cleaning out old furniture and trash." "Good." Morrison moved toward the door, then paused. "You have until tomorrow night to decide, Sister Blackwood. After that, the matter will be out of our hands." After he left, Rowena waited until his car disappeared before retrieving the journal. Her hands shook as she opened it to the final entries, dreading what she might discover about her great-aunt's ultimate fate. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Rowena made her way back to the cabin, her mind still reeling from her discovery in the underground chamber. The metal box felt heavy in her backpack, not from its physical weight, but from the questions it carried. She had spent the night reading and rereading the documents, trying to make sense of what appeared to be her great-aunt's private correspondence with people who had supposedly died decades ago. The cabin looked different in daylight, less foreboding, more like a keeper of secrets waiting to be understood. Rowena pushed through the front door and immediately noticed something that made her pulse quicken. The thick layer of dust on the kitchen table had been disturbed, not by wind or settling. There were clear fingerprint marks in the grime, and they weren't hers. Someone had been here while she was exploring the chamber. She set down her backpack carefully and moved through the cabin with new awareness. The bedroom showed similar signs of careful searching, drawers pulled open just slightly more than she had left them. Papers shifted with almost imperceptible precision. Whoever had been here was practiced at searching without leaving obvious traces. A floorboard creaked behind her. Rowena spun around to find a woman standing in the doorway, perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the room. She wore simple clothes that could have belonged to any of the women from Rowena's former community, but there was something different about her bearing, a confidence that spoke of authority earned rather than assumed. "You found it," the woman said, her gaze falling on Rowena's backpack. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" Rowena demanded, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "What are you doing in my cabin?" The woman stepped into the room with measured steps. "Your cabin, yes, though I wonder if you understand what you've inherited." She gestured toward the backpack. "May I see what you discovered? That depends on who you are and how you knew to look for me here." A slight smile crossed the woman's features. "I'm Sarah Whitmore. I've been waiting for someone to claim this place for 15 years." She moved to the window. looking out at the desert landscape. "Your great-aunt and I were colleagues, you might say. She told me before she died that someday someone would come who was ready to understand." Rowena felt the pieces of a puzzle shifting in her mind, not quite forming a complete picture. Ready to understand what? That some gifts can't be explained by faith or science alone, but exist in the spaces between both. Sarah turned back to Rowena, her expression serious. Helena had certain abilities, healing abilities. The people she helped, the ones who wrote those letters you found, they weren't supposed to survive their illnesses. But they did. The room seemed to tilt slightly as Rowena processed this. "That's impossible." "Is it? You've seen the evidence. Medical records, correspondence spanning decades, people who should have died but instead lived full lives." Sarah moved closer. "The question is what you plan to do with that knowledge." Rowena's mind raced back to her great-aunt's journals, the careful documentation of treatments that had no basis in conventional medicine, the references to methods passed down through generations of women who had learned to work outside established systems. Why was she cast out from the community if she could help people? Because healing that can't be explained threatens those who claim exclusive access to divine power. Sarah's voice carried the weight of old frustrations. Helena chose to help people quietly rather than fight a battle she couldn't win. "And you helped her?" "I documented everything, made sure there would be a record for whoever came after." Sarah gestured around the cabin. This wasn't just Helena's home, it was a sanctuary for people who had nowhere else to turn. Rowena felt a strange recognition settling in her chest, as if pieces of herself she had never understood were suddenly finding their places. "The night I arrived, I thought I heard voices, children playing." Sarah's expression softened. "This place holds memories. Strong emotions leave impressions in places where significant events occurred." Helena always said the cabin remembered every healing, every moment of hope restored. The implications were staggering. Rowena sank onto the edge of the bed, trying to process everything. If this is true, if Helena really could heal people, why hide it? Why not share it with the world? Because the world isn't ready for gifts it can't categorize or control. Sarah sat across from her. But individuals who are suffering, who are desperate, they're ready for hope, regardless of where it comes from. A long silence stretched between them as Rowena contemplated the crossroads she found herself facing. She had come to this cabin as an exile, cast out from everything she had known. Now she was being offered something that could give her life entirely new meaning. "What would Helena expect me to do?" she asked finally. Sarah smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "She'd expect you to choose for yourself. But first, there's something else you need to see." The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Rowena made her way back to the cabin, her mind reeling from what she'd discovered in the cave. The journal felt heavy in her backpack, its leather binding warm against her spine through the worn canvas. She'd spent hours reading by flashlight, her grandmother's elegant script revealing truths that challenged everything the community had taught her. Sarah Blackwood hadn't been the faithful, obedient woman the elders had painted her to be. According to her own words, she'd been asking the same questions that had gotten Rowena cast out. Questions about the nature of divine revelation, about the role of women in receiving it, about whether the community's interpretation of Scripture was the only path to truth. But it was the final entry that had shaken Rowena most deeply. Her grandmother had written about strange occurrences in the desert, lights that danced between the rocks at dusk, voices that seemed to whisper ancient wisdom on the wind, and most disturbing of all, her growing conviction that something sacred existed in this place that predated their community's arrival by centuries. The cabin looked different now, as if the knowledge she carried had shifted her perception. The weathered wood seemed less like decay and more like patina earned through years of keeping secrets. She noticed details she'd missed before, symbols carved faintly into the doorframe, wind chimes made from what looked like ancient pottery shards hanging silent in the still air. Inside, Rowena spread the journal open on the kitchen table and began photographing each page with her phone. The community might have rejected her, but they couldn't erase history. Whatever her grandmother had discovered, whatever truth she'd been pursuing when she died, Rowena was determined to follow that path to its end. A sound outside made her freeze. The distant rumble of an engine carried across the desert, growing steadily closer. Rowena's heart hammered as she quickly closed the journal and shoved it into a kitchen drawer. Through the front window, she watched a familiar black SUV navigate the rough track leading to her cabin. Elder Morrison stepped out first, his white shirt crisp despite the desert heat. Behind him came two younger men Rowena recognized: David Chen, whose family had joined the community when she was a teenager, and Brother Williams, who'd been among the most vocal in demanding her excommunication. Rowena. Elder Morrison's voice carried the same stern authority that had dominated her childhood. "We need to speak with you." She met them at the door but didn't invite them in. "I thought I was no longer your concern." "You'll always be our concern," Morrison replied, though his eyes held no warmth. "We've heard troubling reports. People in town saying you've been asking questions about your grandmother, about this place. Since when is curiosity a sin?" Brother William stepped forward, his face flushed with heat and righteous anger. "Since it threatens the peace of God's people. Your grandmother filled your head with dangerous ideas before she passed, didn't she? That's what started you down this path of apostasy." Something cold settled in Rowena's stomach. "What do you know about my grandmother's ideas?" The three men exchanged glances, and in that moment of silent communication, Rowena understood that they knew more than they'd ever admitted. Her grandmother hadn't simply died in her sleep as they'd told her. There was more to the story. "Sarah Blackwood lost her way in her final years," Morrison said carefully. "The isolation, the desert, it can play tricks on an aging mind. She began to believe she was receiving revelations that contradicted established doctrine. We tried to help her, to bring her back to the truth, but she refused to listen." "What kind of revelations?" "The fevered imaginings of a woman who'd spent too much time alone," Chen interjected. "She claimed this land was sacred to peoples who came before us, that our community had built itself on ground that belonged to others. Nonsense that could have caused great harm if it had spread." Rowena felt pieces clicking into place. "So you silenced her?" "We guided her back to truth," Morrison corrected, "as we tried to guide you. But some souls are too prideful to accept correction." The implied threat hung in the desert air between them. Rowena's hand moved instinctively to the door handle, ready to slam it shut if necessary. "We're not here to fight," Morrison continued. "We're here to offer you one final chance at redemption. Return with us now, renounce these dangerous ideas, and you can come home. Continue down this path, and we wash our hands of you entirely." Looking at their faces, Morrison's cold certainty, Williams's barely contained fury, Chen's uncomfortable but unwavering loyalty, Rowena felt the last threads of her old life snap. These men would never understand what she was discovering, would never accept that truth might exist outside their narrow interpretation of it. "I'm already home," she said quietly, and closed the door. Through the window, she watched them drive away, their SUV disappearing into the shimmering heat haze. Only when the sound of their engine faded completely did she retrieve the journal from its hiding place. Her grandmother's truth was waiting. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally broke just after midnight, sending Rowena scrambling to place buckets under the worst leaks in the cabin's deteriorating roof. Rain drummed against the windows with surprising violence, and she found herself grateful for the distraction from the journal's revelations that had kept her awake anyway. Thunder crashed overhead as she positioned a large pot beneath a particularly aggressive drip near the kitchen table where Miriam's journal still lay open. The pages seemed to glow in the lamplight, as if the words themselves held some inner fire. Rowena had read the final entry 3 times now, each reading revealing new layers of meaning that made her stomach churn. The men came again today. "Brother Thorne says I must choose, renounce what I've seen or face consequences. But how can I unsee the truth? The light in the cave doesn't lie, even if everything else in this place does." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin's frame. and something outside crashed to the ground. Rowena peered through the rain-streaked window, but could see nothing beyond the wall of water cascading from the sky. She was completely cut off now, the dirt road to town likely a river of mud that wouldn't be passable for days. She returned to the journal, flipping back through earlier entries she'd initially skimmed. Miriam's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the months progressed, her words more urgent, more desperate. There were references to the others who knew, a small group of women who had apparently shared Miriam's experiences in what she called the sacred place. Sarah believes we're meant to be the new witnesses, that the old church has lost its way and we're being called to restore the true faith. But Hannah fears we're being deceived. She says the adversary can disguise himself as an angel of light. How do we know which voice to trust? Rowena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Sarah and Hannah. She'd seen those names in the local cemetery during her supply runs to town. Both had died young, within months of each other, according to their headstones, within months of when these journal entries were written. Lightning illuminated the cabin in stark white, and in that brief moment, Rowena could have sworn she saw a figure standing outside the window. She blinked, heart hammering, but the darkness had already swallowed everything again. Just her imagination, surely. The storm and the journal's disturbing contents were making her paranoid. But then came the knocking. 3 deliberate raps on the front door, barely audible over the thunder, but unmistakably intentional. Rowena froze, the journal sliding from her lap to the floor. No one could have made it out here in this weather. No one should even know she was here. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely steady. Silence, broken only by the rain's relentless assault on the roof. Rowena approached the door slowly, avoiding the worst of the leaks pooling on the floor. The old wood felt solid beneath her palm as she pressed against it, listening. Nothing. She was about to turn away when a voice spoke, so close to the door it seemed to come from inside the cabin itself. Rowena. Her name, spoken in a woman's voice she didn't recognize. Low and urgent, barely louder than a whisper. "I know you're reading her words. But words can lie. You need to see for yourself." "See what?" Rowena whispered back, her mouth pressed close to the door. "Who are you?" "The cave, Rowena. Before they come for you too. Before it's too late." The rain seemed to intensify, drowning out any other sounds. Rowena waited, counting her heartbeats, but the voice didn't come again. After several minutes, she cracked the door open. Nothing. Just sheets of rain and darkness, so complete she couldn't see 5 feet beyond the covered porch. But there, barely visible in the mud, were footprints leading away from the door toward the desert. Footprints that the rain should have washed away instantly. She slammed the door and threw the bolt, backing away until she hit the kitchen table. The journal lay open on the floor where it had fallen, and she snatched it up, searching for any mention of the cave Miriam had referenced. There, near the end, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible, "The light is dying. I can feel it leaving, taking the truth with it. If something happens to me, if they silence me like they silenced the others, someone needs to know, someone needs to witness. The cave behind the red rocks, where the petroglyphs watch, where the real revelation waits. But be careful, they're watching too. They'll do anything to keep their version of truth intact." Outside, the storm raged on, but Rowena barely heard it anymore. Her mind was focused on a single terrible certainty. Whoever had been at her door tonight knew she'd found Miriam's journal, which meant her secret refuge wasn't secret at all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Rowena made her way to the old mining shaft she'd discovered behind the cabin. 3 days had passed since she'd found the journal entries hidden beneath the loose floorboard, and sleep had become elusive. The words of her great-great-grandmother, Mercy Caldwell, echoed in her mind like whispered secrets from beyond the grave. The children see things differently after the ceremony. Their eyes change, not just the color, something deeper. Rowena clutched the leather-bound journal against her chest, its pages filled with increasingly frantic observations about missing children, unexplained healings, and rituals conducted in the darkness of the desert caves. Mercy had been documenting something the early Mormon settlers had discovered, or perhaps summoned in these desolate hills. The mining shaft entrance loomed before her, a jagged mouth carved into the red rock face. Yesterday, she'd only peered inside with her flashlight, but today she felt compelled to venture deeper. The journal's final entries mentioned a chamber decorated with symbols that predated any known settlement in the area. As she descended into the cool darkness, her flashlight beam danced across the tunnel walls. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying a metallic taste that made her tongue feel numb. 20 feet down, the shaft opened into a wider cavern, just as Mercy had described. But nothing could have prepared Rowena for what she found there. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to pulse and shift in the unstable light. They weren't random scratches or simple pictographs. These were deliberate, complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the chamber sat a stone altar, its surface stained with something dark that had long since dried to a rust-colored crust. Scattered around the altar's base were small objects that made Rowena's breath catch in her throat. Children's toys from different eras, a wooden doll that could have been from the 1800s, a tin soldier that looked turn of the century, and, disturbingly, a small plastic figurine that couldn't have been more than a few years old. Her hands trembling, Rowena opened the journal and read Mercy's final entry by flashlight. October 31st, 1889. They took little Samuel tonight. I tried to stop them, but Brother Matthias said it was God's will. They say the children who survive the ceremony become vessels of divine power, that their abilities help the community prosper. But I've seen what becomes of them afterward. They're not children anymore. There's something else wearing children's faces. I'm leaving this record in case others come looking. The symbols in the lower chamber, they're not from any earthly source. Whatever the first settlers found here, whatever they made their bargain with, it's still hungry. It's always hungry. A sound from the tunnel entrance made Rowena spin around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Footsteps echoed off the stone walls, slow, deliberate, multiple sets moving in perfect synchronization. Rowena. The voice that called her name was calm and familiar. Bishop Crawford emerged from the tunnel, followed by 2 other men she recognized from her former ward. Their faces were eerily serene in the harsh flashlight glare. "How did you find me?" she asked, backing toward the far wall of the chamber. "You've been asking questions in town. People talk." Crawford's eyes swept over the carved walls with what looked like reverence rather than surprise. "We hoped you'd leave well enough alone, but the bloodline always calls, doesn't it?" "Bloodline? Mercy Caldwell was your ancestor, wasn't she? The family that built that cabin?" Crawford stepped closer to the altar, running his fingers along its edge. She never understood the greater purpose, the sacrifice required for true faith. The other men moved to flank Rowena, cutting off her retreat. In the dim light, she noticed something wrong with their eyes. The pupils were too large, too dark, as if they reflected no light at all. "The children who come here willingly are transformed," Crawford continued. "They become conduits for something far greater than themselves. Your community didn't cast you out for questioning, Rowena. We've been guiding you here all along." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity, the carefully orchestrated shunning that had left her isolated and desperate, the convenient inheritance that had drawn her to this exact location. Even the way she'd been compelled to explore deeper, to dig into family history she'd never cared about before. "The ceremony requires willing participation," Crawford explained, as the 2 men began lighting candles placed in carved niches around the chamber. "Force dilutes the effect, but desperation, isolation, the need to belong somewhere, that creates the perfect conditions for acceptance." The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight, and Rowena felt something ancient and patient turning its attention toward her. In the distance, she could hear more footsteps echoing through the tunnel system, and children's voices singing a hymn she almost recognized. The ceremony was about to begin. The photographs scattered across the kitchen table like fallen leaves, each one a window into a past Rowena never knew existed. Her grandmother's face looked back at her from dozens of images, young, radiant, surrounded by people in elaborate robes and strange geometric symbols carved into stone backgrounds. The woman she'd known as a devout Mormon pioneer had apparently lived an entirely different life. Rowena's hands trembled as she lifted a photograph dated 1952. Her grandmother stood beside a tall man with kind eyes and intricate tattoos covering his arms. Behind them, a massive stone structure rose against a desert sky that looked nothing like Utah. The writing on the back was in her grandmother's careful script, with David at the Temple of the Seven Moons. The ritual worked. Sarah walks again. Sarah, Rowena's great-aunt who had supposedly died of polio as a child, according to family stories. Yet here was evidence suggesting something far more extraordinary had occurred. A sudden noise from the front of the cabin made her freeze. Footsteps on the wooden porch, deliberate and heavy. Through the grimy window she glimpsed a black sedan parked beside her old Honda. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly gathered the photographs, shoving them into the wooden box. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin. "Rowena Blackwood, we know you're in there." The voice was unfamiliar, but carried an authority that made her skin crawl. She clutched the box tighter, her mind racing through possible escape routes. The back door led to open desert, but they'd see her running. The root cellar might provide temporary hiding, but eventually they'd search everywhere. "We just want to talk," another voice called out, this one female and deceptively gentle, "about your grandmother's research, about what you've found." Research. They knew about the photographs, the journal, the strange artifacts, which meant they'd been watching her, probably since she'd arrived at the cabin. Rowena's mouth went dry as she realized how exposed she'd been, how naive to think her grandmother's secrets would stay buried forever. She moved silently toward the bedroom, where the window might offer a better vantage point. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see 2 figures on the porch, a man in an expensive suit despite the desert heat, and a woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. They didn't look like typical church officials or local law enforcement. Something about their posture, their coordinated movements, suggested military or government training. The door handle rattled. "Miss Blackwood, we understand you've been excommunicated from your church. We might be able to help with that situation if you cooperate with us." The offer hit her like a physical blow. Return to her community, to her family, to the only life she'd ever known. The temptation was overwhelming, even knowing these strangers couldn't possibly have that kind of influence. Could they? "Your grandmother was involved with a very dangerous organization," the woman continued. "People who claimed they could perform miracles, heal the sick, even raise the dead. We need to know what she told you, what she left behind." Rowena pressed her back against the bedroom wall, pieces of the puzzle clicking together in her mind. The healing rituals described in the journal, the photographs of impossible recoveries, her grandmother's careful documentation of events that defied medical explanation. Had she stumbled onto evidence of something that threatened powerful interests? Through the thin walls, she heard the distinctive click of a lock being picked. These weren't church officials or concerned neighbors. They were professionals, and they were coming in whether she cooperated or not. Moving as quietly as possible, she lifted the bedroom window and slipped the wooden box through the opening onto the sandy ground below. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the cabin, broken only by scattered rocks and stubborn sagebrush. If she could reach her car, or even make it to the highway, she might have a chance. The front door creaked open. "Search everything," the man's voice commanded. "Documents, artifacts, anything that looks remotely ceremonial. And find those photographs. The file says there should be dozens of them." Rowena's blood turned to ice. They had a file on her grandmother, which meant this went deeper than simple curiosity about strange desert hermits. Someone had been tracking her grandmother's activities for years, possibly decades. She eased one leg through the window, then paused as footsteps moved through the cabin's main room. Heavy boots on wooden floors, drawers being yanked open, furniture scraped across the floor. They were being thorough but not careful. They wanted her to know they were there, to feel trapped. As her feet touched the ground outside, a thought struck her with crystalline clarity. These people were afraid. Whatever her grandmother had discovered, whatever impossible things she'd documented and preserved, it threatened something large enough and powerful, enough to send professionals into the middle of nowhere to silence an excommunicated Mormon woman. Which meant the miracles might be real. And if they were real, Rowena held proof that could change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert as Rowena stood outside the cabin, clutching the leather journal she'd discovered hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside its yellowed pages lay her great-grandmother's confessions, stories of visions that contradicted everything the church had taught, miracles that defied their careful doctrine, and most disturbing of all, evidence that the community's founding fathers had deliberately suppressed these revelations. Sheriff Martinez's truck appeared on the horizon, dust trailing behind it like a warning. Rowena had called him the night before, her voice shaking as she'd tried to explain what she'd found without sounding completely unhinged. Now, watching his approach, doubt crept in. What if he thought she was just another apostate spinning conspiracy theories? The truck pulled up beside her weathered Honda, and Martinez emerged, his uniform already showing sweat stains despite the early hour. His expression was unreadable behind his sunglasses, but Rowena caught the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was taking this seriously. "You sounded spooked on the phone," he said without preamble. "What's got you rattled?" Rowena held up the journal. My great-grandmother, Miriam Blackwood. She documented everything, visions, prophecies, miracles that the church elders buried. But there's more. She paused, struggling with how to voice her growing suspicions. "Sheriff, what if Sarah Chen's disappearance isn't random? What if someone's trying to silence people who might validate these accounts?" Martinez removed his sunglasses, his dark eyes studying her face. "That's a serious accusation, Rowena. You're talking about connecting a missing person case to century-old church politics. Read this." She opened the journal to a passage she'd marked. Miriam writes about a vision where she saw the daughters of truth scattered like seeds in the desert wind, their voices silenced by those who fear the light. She describes specific landmarks, the red rock formation where Sarah was last seen, the old mining caves. And look at the date. Martinez leaned closer, his expression shifting as he read. This was written in 1934. Exactly, 70 years before Sarah was even born. Rowena's voice gained strength as she spoke. But it gets worse. I found correspondence between Miriam and other women in the community. They were planning to present their visions to the church leadership, to challenge some fundamental interpretations of doctrine. Then, suddenly, all the letters stop. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the empty landscape. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Finally, he spoke. "You think someone in the community has access to these old records, that they're using them to identify threats?" Rowena finished. "Think about it. Sarah was working on a historical thesis about women's roles in early Mormon settlements. She was asking questions just like I did, just like Miriam did." Martinez walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Show me everything you found." Inside the musty interior, Rowena had laid out all of Miriam's papers on the rickety table. Maps with strange markings, pressed flowers with handwritten notes about their symbolic meanings, and most unsettling of all, a detailed genealogy that traced bloodlines through the community with cryptic annotations. "Here," Rowena pointed to a family tree. "Look at these names marked with red ink. They're all women who reported visions or challenged church authority. And here," she traced her finger down the page, "their descendants, including Sarah's family line, and mine." Martinez studied the documents, his law enforcement training evident in how methodically he examined each piece of evidence. This suggests someone's been tracking specific families for decades. But who would have access to both historical church records and current community information? Before Rowena could answer, they heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Through the grimy window, she saw Elder Thomas Blackwood's black SUV pulling up beside the sheriff's truck. Her breath caught. She hadn't seen her uncle since the day they'd cast her out. "I called him," Martinez said quietly, noting her alarm. "If there's a conspiracy involving church leadership, we need to know who we can trust." Elder Blackwood stepped out of his vehicle, his face grave. Even from a distance, Rowena could see he looked older, more worn than when she'd last seen him. As he approached the cabin, she noticed something she'd never observed before. A slight tremor in his hands, a haunted quality to his eyes. "Uncle Thomas," she said as he entered, unsure whether to expect condemnation or reconciliation. But instead of the cold disapproval she remembered, his face crumpled with what looked like relief mixed with fear. "Rowena, thank God you're safe. When Sheriff Martinez told me about Miriam's journal," he paused, glancing at the papers spread across the table, "there are things you need to know, things I should have told you long ago." The admission hung in the air like a confession waiting to be heard. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, casting the desert in an ominous twilight despite the morning hour. The photograph trembled in Rowena's hands as she stared at the familiar face looking back at her. Her great-great-grandmother, Lydia, stood beside a man she didn't recognize, both dressed in simple frontier clothing. But it wasn't their appearance that made her breath catch. It was the backdrop behind them. The same distinctive rock formations that surrounded her desert cabin, the same gnarled Joshua tree that still stood in the yard, though decades younger. "She lived here," Rowena whispered to the empty room. "Lydia lived in this exact place." The implications crashed over her like a flash flood through the arroyos. Every family story she'd been told painted Lydia as a faithful pioneer woman who died young in Salt Lake City. Yet here was proof that she'd spent time in this remote corner of Nevada, far from the main Mormon settlements. Rowena's hands shook as she turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "L. and Samuel, 1887. The work continues in secret." Samuel. The name meant nothing to her, but something about his face nagged at her memory. She'd seen those features before, perhaps in another family photograph or... The realization hit her like a physical blow. She scrambled back to the trunk, pulling out the worn journal she'd found earlier. The handwriting that had seemed so familiar now made perfect sense. This was Lydia's journal, written during her time at the cabin. With trembling fingers, she opened to a random page and began to read. "Samuel says the visions are becoming stronger. Each night the same message comes to us both. The church has lost its way. The leaders in Salt Lake speak of revelation, but they cannot see past their own hunger for power and control. We have been called to preserve the true teachings, to wait for the restoration that must come." Rowena's mouth went dry. She flipped to another entry. "The women came to us again today, 3 of them this time. Sarah's husband threatened to kill her if she didn't stop asking questions about the temple ceremonies. Mary was cast out for suggesting that perhaps God spoke to women too. We gave them shelter, food, and most importantly, we listened. Samuel believes this is why we were led here, to be a refuge for those the church abandons." The journal entries painted a picture that contradicted everything Rowena had been taught. Lydia hadn't been a model of religious obedience. She'd been a rebel, questioning the church's authority and providing sanctuary for other dissidents. The similarities to Rowena's own situation were impossible to ignore. She read deeper into the night, learning about the small community of heretics that had gathered around Lydia and Samuel. They'd called themselves the Restoration Society, believing that the Mormon church had strayed from its original revelations. They practiced a form of worship that emphasized personal revelation and gender equality, radical concepts for the 1880s. One entry made her heart race. "The gift has manifested again. When little Thomas lay dying of fever, I placed my hands upon his head and felt the power flow through me. The sickness lifted like morning mist. Samuel warns me to be careful who sees such things. The church leaders would call it witchcraft, but I know it is God's love made manifest. This gift runs in bloodlines, he tells me. My daughters may inherit it, and their daughters after them. Rowena's hands flew to her throat. The dreams, the visions, the strange occurrences she'd experienced since arriving at the cabin, they suddenly took on new meaning. The night she'd felt compelled to check on old Pete, only to find him collapsed in his trailer. The way her touch had seemed to ease his pain, the vivid dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. She turned the page with growing urgency. We have hidden the most precious items in the foundation stones, beneath the cabin floor. The manuscript Samuel has translated, the records of our revelations, the proof of what we have witnessed. If something happens to us, perhaps future generations will find them and understand. The bloodline will call to the bloodline, as Samuel says. When the time is right, one will come who can continue the work. Rowena shot to her feet, the journal clutched against her chest. The loose floorboard she'd noticed her first day here, the one that creaked differently from the others. She'd dismissed it as old construction settling, but now, racing to the corner of the main room, she dropped to her knees and ran her hands over the wooden planks. There, a board that sat slightly higher than the others, its edges worn smooth as if it had been removed many times. She worked her fingers under the edge and lifted. Below lay a metal box, its surface green with age, but still intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were dozens of documents covered in strange symbols and text. At the very bottom, she found a letter addressed simply to the one who comes after. The envelope felt warm beneath her fingers as she opened it, as if it had been waiting for her touch. The letter inside was written in Lydia's familiar hand. To my descendant who has found this place, you have been called here not by accident, but by design. The gifts that mark our bloodline have awakened in you, as I knew they would. What the church calls heresy, we know to be truth. You are not cast out, you are chosen. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset, and Rowena pulled her jacket tighter as she sat on the cabin's front steps, staring at the manila envelope Marcus had left behind. Inside were photocopies of land deeds, mineral rights documents, and geological surveys dating back to the 1940s. The papers told a story she was still struggling to believe. Her grandfather hadn't been a simple rancher. He'd been part of a secret government operation, one that had transformed this remote stretch of desert into something far more significant than anyone in her family had ever known. The uranium deposits beneath the property weren't just valuable, they were connected to the Manhattan Project itself. A coyote howled in the distance, its voice echoing off the canyon walls. Rowena shivered, though not entirely from the cold. Everything she'd experienced here, the strange lights, the healing spring, the visions, suddenly felt different. Not miraculous, scientific. The radiation from the underground deposits could explain the phosphorescence in the water. It could explain the hallucinations. It could even explain why the wildlife behaved so strangely around the property. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Haven't heard from you. Are you okay?" Rowena stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. Was she okay? She'd been cast out from her community, inherited a radioactive property, and spent weeks believing she was experiencing divine intervention. Now she wasn't sure what to believe about anything. She typed back, still figuring things out. "We'll call tomorrow." The envelope crinkled as she stood and walked back inside. The cabin felt different now, tainted by knowledge she couldn't unknow. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the oil lamp seemed to whisper of secrets and lies. She spread the documents across the kitchen table, studying them under the flickering light. One particular survey caught her attention, a hand-drawn map showing underground tunnel systems that stretched far beyond her property lines. Red X's marked specific locations, with notes scribbled in the margins. High concentration, unusual formations, requires further investigation. Her grandfather's signature appeared on several documents, always alongside government officials whose names had been redacted. The dates spanned nearly 2 decades, from 1943 to 1962. He'd been monitoring this site, reporting on it, keeping its secrets long after the war ended. A knock at the door made her jump. She glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. Through the window she could see a silhouette on the porch, but the darkness made it impossible to identify the visitor. "Rowena? It's Dr. Elizabeth Harmon. We need to talk." The name was unfamiliar, but the woman's voice carried an authority that made Rowena hesitate before answering. "It's late. Can this wait until morning?" "I'm afraid not. Marcus Delacroix contacted me about your situation. I'm with the Department of Energy's Office of Legacy Management. We have a problem." Rowena's mouth went dry. She gathered the documents quickly, shoving them back into the envelope before opening the door. The woman standing on her porch was middle-aged, wearing a government-issued windbreaker and carrying a metal briefcase. Her expression was grim. "May I come in? We have a lot to discuss, and very little time." Against her better judgment, Rowena stepped aside. Dr. Harmon entered and glanced around the cabin with practiced efficiency, her gaze lingering on the envelope in Rowena's hands. "I see Marcus shared the historical documents. Good, that saves us some time." She set her briefcase on the table and opened it, revealing sophisticated electronic equipment. "I need to be direct with you, Miss Pierce. Your property sits on one of the most contaminated sites from the early nuclear program. The spring you've been drinking from? The water table has been compromised for decades." The room seemed to tilt. Rowena gripped the back of a chair for support. "Contaminated how? Marcus said the levels were within acceptable ranges." "Marcus Delacroix is a freelance researcher with limited access to classified information. The truth is more complicated." Dr. Harmon pulled out a tablet, swiping through charts and graphs. "The contamination isn't just radiation. There were experimental compounds tested here in the 1950s, psychoactive substances designed to enhance interrogation techniques. The effects can include vivid hallucinations, heightened emotional states, and in some cases, temporary telepathic sensitivity." The words hit like physical blows. Every vision, every moment of clarity she'd experienced, every sense of connection to something greater, it was all chemistry. Poison masquerading as revelation. "How long?" Rowena's voice came out as a whisper. "How long have I been exposed?" "Based on your symptoms and the timeline Marcus provided, approximately 6 weeks. The good news is that the effects are reversible with proper treatment. The bad news is that this site needs immediate containment, and you need immediate medical attention." Through the window, Rowena could see vehicles approaching in the distance, their headlights cutting through the desert darkness like predatory eyes. The isolation that had once felt like sanctuary now felt like a trap closing around her. "What happens to me now?" she asked. Dr. Harmon's expression softened slightly. "That depends entirely on your cooperation." The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the desert floor as Rowena knelt beside the disturbed earth behind the cabin. Her hands shook as she brushed away loose dirt, revealing more of what she'd glimpsed the night before. The partial skeletal remains were small, delicate, unmistakably those of a child. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice catching in the dry air. The leather journal lay open beside her, its pages fluttering in the desert breeze. She'd read her great-great-grandmother's final entries 3 times, but the words still seemed impossible. The miracle child, the one the community had whispered about in reverent tones for generations, hadn't ascended to heaven as the stories claimed. She'd died here, in this remote place, buried hastily in the desert soil. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind her. Rowena spun around to find Bishop Harrison approaching, his black sedan parked near the cabin. His weathered face was grim, his eyes fixed on the excavation site. "I was wondering when you'd find her," he said quietly. The words hit Rowena like a physical blow. "You knew?" Harrison stopped a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. My grandfather told me the truth before he died, as his grandfather had told him. The burden passes down through the leadership, generation after generation. The burden. Rowena's voice rose. She was 7 years old. She was dying, Harrison said simply. The fever had taken hold. Your ancestor Elizabeth brought her here hoping the isolation would help her recover, but it was too late. Rowena stood slowly, dirt falling from her knees. So instead of admitting a child died of illness, the community chose to lie, to build an entire mythology around her disappearance. You have to understand the context, Harrison said, stepping closer. This was 1847. The community was struggling, people were losing faith. They needed something to believe in, something to give them hope. When little Sarah vanished, when Elizabeth returned with stories of lights and voices, it gave them exactly what they needed. A lie. A necessary fiction. Harrison's voice hardened. That story sustained our community for over a century and a half. It brought people together, gave them strength during the hardest times. How many lives were saved by that hope? How many families stayed together because they believed in something greater than their suffering? Rowena felt sick. And Elizabeth? She just went along with it? Harrison gestured toward the journal. Read her later entries. The grief nearly destroyed her. She tried to tell the truth several times, but the elders convinced her that the greater good required her silence. Eventually, she retreated here, to this cabin, to live with what she'd done. The pieces were falling into place now. Elizabeth's isolation, her strange behavior in later years, the way she'd left this place to family rather than the church. It all made terrible sense. How many others know? Rowena asked. Very few. The current leadership, select elders. We've always understood that some truths are too dangerous to share. Too dangerous or too inconvenient. The weight of his words settled over her like dust. Every family gathering, every tradition, every moment of comfort her relatives had found in their faith, all of it built on a foundation of lies. People have a right to know the truth, she said finally. Do they? Harrison moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. What exactly do you think will happen when you reveal this? The community will fracture. Families will be torn apart. People will lose the faith that sustained them through everything from the Depression to personal tragedies. And for what? To satisfy your need to be right? To stop living a lie. Sometimes lies are kinder than truth. Rowena looked down at the small bones partially exposed in the desert earth. Somewhere in the community, Sarah's story was probably being told to children at this very moment, filling them with wonder and hope. The thought made her stomach turn. I won't be part of this cover-up, she said. Harrison nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. I hoped you might see reason, but I understand your position. He paused, studying her face. Just remember, once this comes out, there's no taking it back. The consequences will ripple through hundreds of lives. Make sure you can live with that responsibility. He turned and walked back toward his car, leaving Rowena alone with the remains and the terrible weight of choice. In the distance, she could see the community spread across the valley, people going about their daily lives, sustained by a faith built on tragedy transformed into miracle. The truth felt heavy in her hands, sharp-edged and dangerous. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up dust clouds as it disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Rowena standing in the sudden silence of the desert. Deputy Martinez had been skeptical but thorough, documenting everything she'd shown him in the hidden chamber beneath the cabin. The photographs, the journals, the carefully preserved evidence of her great Aunt Constance's underground railroad for women fleeing polygamous marriages. Now, clutching the manila envelope Martinez had left behind, Rowena felt the weight of decades pressing against her chest. Inside were photocopies of missing persons reports dating back 40 years, faces of women who had vanished from fundamentalist compounds across 3 states. Women whose final refuge had been this crumbling cabin, this sanctuary built from secrets and fierce love. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. Rowena walked slowly back toward the cabin, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd uncovered. Her excommunication from the Mormon church seemed like a distant memory now, a small wound compared to the vast network of suffering and resistance that had operated from this very ground. She paused at the porch steps, remembering the first day she'd arrived here 3 months ago. Bitter, lost, convinced her life was over, the woman who had collapsed on these same steps, sobbing into the splintered wood, felt like a stranger now. That woman had been searching for validation, for someone to tell her she belonged somewhere. This woman, the one standing here now, was beginning to understand that belonging wasn't something bestowed by others. The screen door creaked as she entered the cabin. The loose floorboard that concealed the entrance to the hidden chamber lay exposed, a dark mouth leading to truths she was still processing. She'd spent the afternoon showing Deputy Martinez everything: the carefully organized files, the emergency supplies that had sustained desperate women, the hand-drawn maps marking safe houses across the southwest. Constance Harrington hadn't been the eccentric hermit the family had whispered about. She'd been a guardian, a fierce protector operating in the shadows of a system that failed vulnerable women. The journals revealed a network of doctors, lawyers, and social workers who had quietly supported her work, moving women to safety when their lives were threatened by patriarchal violence disguised as religious devotion. Rowena settled into the kitchen chair, where she'd spent so many evenings reading by lamplight. The envelope crinkled as she opened it again, studying the faces of the missing women. Some were barely 18, others middle-aged mothers who had finally found the courage to run. All of them had found their way here, to this unlikely sanctuary built by a woman the world had written off as strange and worthless. The parallels weren't lost on her. How many times had she heard similar dismissals during her own questioning of church doctrine? The subtle suggestions that her doubts made her dangerous, unstable, a threat to the faithful. She'd internalized those voices, let them convince her that her questions were evidence of moral failing rather than intellectual courage. But Constance's story offered a different narrative. The journals spoke of a woman who had walked away from a comfortable life in Salt Lake City after witnessing too many women trapped by religious orthodoxy that prioritized institutional power over human dignity. She'd used her inheritance to buy this remote property, slowly building a refuge that existed outside official channels, beyond the reach of religious authorities and complicit law enforcement. The telephone rang, startling Rowena from her thoughts. She'd had the old rotary phone reconnected weeks ago, one of many small acts of claiming this space as her own. "Rowena? It's Dr. Sarah Chen." The voice was crisp, professional. "Deputy Martinez gave me your number. He said you might have some questions about the historical significance of your property." Rowena's pulse quickened. "You knew about what Constance was doing?" A long pause. "My grandmother was one of the women your great-aunt helped. She escaped a plural marriage in 1987, stayed in your cabin for 3 weeks while we arranged new documents and safe passage to California. She spoke about Constance until the day she died, called her an angel." The words hit Rowena like a physical force. An angel. She thought about the judgment in the eyes of her former congregation, the way they'd spoken about her questioning as if it were a contagion. Meanwhile, a woman they would have dismissed as a heretic had spent decades embodying the very compassion they claimed to represent. "Dr. Chen," Rowena said carefully, "how many people know about this network?" "More than you might think. Your great-aunt didn't work alone, and the need didn't disappear when she died. There are still women who need safe passage, still places where religious authority is used to justify abuse." Through the kitchen window, Rowena watched the last light fade from the desert sky. The silence that had once felt like abandonment now felt like possibility. She was beginning to understand that her inheritance included more than just property and possessions. Constance had left her a legacy of resistance, a blueprint for transforming exile into sanctuary. The FBI agent's footsteps echoed through the desert silence as she approached the cabin, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. Rowena watched from behind the curtained window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Beside her, Marcus gripped the wooden box containing the journals, his knuckles white with tension. "She's alone," he whispered, but Rowena could see the doubt in his eyes. After everything they'd uncovered about the community's financial empire, about the missing women, about the web of lies that stretched back generations, trusting anyone felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. Agent Sarah Chen had been investigating the disappearances for months, following a trail that led from Salt Lake City to the remote desert communities, where questions weren't asked and answers weren't given. When Rowena had finally worked up the courage to call the FBI hotline, Chen had been the one to answer. The knock came firm and authoritative. "Miss Blackwood, it's Agent Chen. I'm here alone, as promised." Rowena exchanged a glance with Marcus, then moved to the door. Through the peephole she could see the agent's identification held clearly visible. Taking a shaky breath, she opened the door. Agent Chen was younger than Rowena had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She stepped inside, her gaze immediately drawn to the scattered papers, photographs, and journals that covered every surface of the small cabin. "My God," Chen breathed, moving toward the table where Rowena had laid out the most damning evidence. "How long have you been collecting all this?" "Most of it was already here," Rowena said, her voice hoarse from days of little sleep and constant fear. "Hidden in the walls, buried in the cellar. My grandmother Sarah, she documented everything." Chen picked up one of the journals, her expression growing darker as she scanned the pages. "These dates go back decades, the names, the ages." She looked up sharply. Some of these girls were reported missing, cases that went cold because local law enforcement claimed they'd run away, joined other communities. "They didn't run away," Marcus said quietly. "At least, not all of them. Some tried to expose what was happening. Some got pregnant by the wrong men. Some just asked too many questions." The agent continued reading, her professional composure cracking slightly as she absorbed the full scope of what they'd uncovered. The systematic abuse, the forced marriages, the elaborate financial schemes that funneled money through shell companies and offshore accounts. But worst of all were the disappearances. Young women who had threatened the community's carefully maintained facade of righteousness. "Your grandmother was brave," Chen said, looking directly at Rowena. "Documenting this took incredible courage. She must have known the risks." Rowena felt tears threaten again. She paid for it. They made her life hell, isolated her, made everyone believe she was losing her mind. But she never stopped believing that someday someone would find the truth. Chen nodded, already pulling out her phone. "I need to call this in, get a team out here. This evidence, it's going to bring down a lot of people. Are you prepared for what comes next?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Rowena thought about her mother, still trapped in that world of rigid rules and blind obedience. She thought about her siblings, who would probably never speak to her again after this. She thought about the other young women still trapped in the community, believing they had no choice, no voice, no worth beyond what the men decided to give them. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. Over the next hour, Chen made calls while Rowena and Marcus organized the evidence chronologically. Federal agents were being dispatched from multiple field offices. Financial crimes specialists were already pulling records based on the account numbers found in the journals. The wheels of justice, so long stalled, were finally beginning to turn. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose, Chen closed her phone and turned to them both. "There's going to be a lot of interviews, a lot of testimony. Some of these cases, they're going to be hard to prosecute after so many years. But what you've given us, it's enough to start unraveling everything." Rowena nodded, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. For weeks, she'd carried the weight of these secrets alone, terrified that she was betraying everything she'd been taught to believe. Now, finally, she understood that the real betrayal would have been staying silent. Outside, the first headlights appeared on the distant highway, growing larger as they approached the cabin. More agents, more investigators, more people who would finally listen to the voices that had been silenced for so long. "They're going to fight this," Chen warned. "The community leaders, their lawyers. They have money, influence, connections. It won't be easy." Rowena looked around the small cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the evidence that would finally give her grandmother's suffering meaning. Nothing worth doing ever is. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Rowena stood before the assembled crowd outside her cabin. Word had spread faster than wildfire through the scattered communities. Former believers, current faithful, curious outsiders, and reporters drawn by whispers of miracles in the wasteland. She hadn't expected this many people, hadn't prepared for the weight of their collective gaze. Bishop Morrison stood at the front of the group, his weathered face a mask of skepticism and barely contained anger. Behind him, she recognized faces from her old ward, people who had once been neighbors, friends, family. They looked at her now with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. "Show us," Morrison said, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "Show us these supposed revelations you claim to have found." Rowena's hands trembled as she held the leather-bound journal her grandmother had hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards. Beside her, Elena Rodriguez adjusted her camera equipment while Dr. Marcus Chen checked his instruments one final time. The academic team had arrived 3 days ago, drawn by Elena's initial documentation of what they'd discovered. "This isn't about proving anything to you," Rowena said, finding her voice. "This is about truth, about the stories we tell ourselves and the ones we inherit without question." She opened the journal to the first entry, dated 63 years ago, written in her grandmother's careful script. The crowd pressed closer as she began to read aloud. "Today I spoke with the voice again. It tells me things, not prophecies or commandments, but memories, ancient memories of this land, of peoples who lived and loved and grieved here long before our pioneers arrived. The voice doesn't speak of chosen people or promised lands. It speaks of belonging, of connection, of the sacred thread that binds all seeking souls across time." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Bishop Morrison's jaw tightened. "Your grandmother was ill in her final years," he said. "Everyone knew she suffered from delusions." "Did they?" Dr. Chen stepped forward, tablet in hand. "Because the geological surveys we've conducted suggest otherwise. The mineral composition beneath this cabin is unique. High concentrations of quartz and other piezoelectric materials. The acoustic properties alone could explain auditory phenomena." "Science," Morrison scoffed. "You would reduce the divine to mere rock and crystal?" "I would suggest," Chen replied calmly, "that the divine might work through rock and crystal as easily as through anything else." Rowena continued reading, her voice growing stronger with each passage. Her grandmother had documented years of conversations with what she called the voice, not commandments from on high, but something deeper, older, more fundamental. A consciousness woven into the very fabric of the desert itself. The crowd listened in rapt attention as Rowena read about visions of ancient pueblos, of Native American ceremonies performed on this exact spot, of Spanish missionaries and Mexican settlers and finally Mormon pioneers, all drawn to this place by something they couldn't quite name. The voice had spoken to many of them, her grandmother wrote, though few had been willing to listen past their own predetermined beliefs. She discovered that the original property deed was fraudulent, Rowena said, her voice cutting through the desert air. "This land was never legally purchased from the Paiute tribe. Our entire settlement, everything we built here, was founded on theft." The crowd erupted in angry voices, denials, accusations. Bishop Morrison raised his hand for silence. "Even if that were true," he said, "it changes nothing. We have made this desert bloom. We have built something sacred here." "Built on what foundation?" The new voice came from the back of the crowd. An elderly Native American woman pushed forward, her presence commanding immediate attention. "I am Sarah Blackhorse, granddaughter of Chief Winnemucca." My family has maintained the oral history of this region for generations." She gestured toward the cabin, toward the rock formations beyond. "This place has always been sacred, long before your people arrived. Your grandmother," she nodded toward Rowena, "was one of the few who listened when the land tried to tell its true story." Elena stepped forward, her camera capturing everything. "The acoustic phenomena are real," she said. "We have recordings, measurements, documentation. Something here is amplifying sound, creating resonances that could easily be interpreted as voices. But more importantly, Miss Blackhorse and her tribal council have legal documentation proving their claim to this land." Bishop Morrison's face flushed red. "This is preposterous. Our church has held this territory for over a century." "Illegally," Sarah Blackhorse said quietly. "But we're not here to drive anyone away. We're here to discuss coexistence, to honor both the sacred nature of this place and the communities that have grown here." Rowena felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized what her grandmother had truly left her. Not just a cabin in the desert, but a bridge between worlds, between peoples, between different understandings of the sacred. "Faith doesn't require ignorance," she said to the crowd. "Truth doesn't diminish wonder. Maybe it's time we learn to listen to voices we've been taught to ignore." The desert wind picked up, whistling through the rock formations with an almost musical quality, as if the land itself was adding its voice to the conversation. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber as Rowena stood before the restored cabin, her hands still bearing traces of yesterday's work. The structure that had once threatened to collapse now stood strong, its weathered wood glowing with newfound purpose. She had spent the past 3 weeks transforming it from a repository of secrets into something else entirely, a sanctuary. The hidden room behind the false wall had been opened permanently, its contents carefully catalogued and preserved. Letters from desperate souls seeking refuge, photographs of families torn apart by rigid doctrine, journals filled with questions that mirrored her own. All of it now formed the foundation of what she had decided to call simply the Haven. Sarah's truck rumbled up the dusty path, followed by 2 other vehicles Rowena didn't recognize. Her friend emerged first, carrying a box of supplies, her face bright with determination. Behind her came a young couple Rowena had never seen before. The woman clutched an infant to her chest while the man carried their meager belongings in a single duffel bag. "This is Marcus and Elena," Sarah said by way of introduction. "They're from the fundamentalist community up north. Elena's family disowned her for refusing to enter a plural marriage." Rowena stepped forward, remembering her own first desperate days after excommunication. "You're safe here," she said simply, and watched as Elena's shoulders sagged with relief. Over the following hours, more arrivals trickled in. A teenager who had been cast out for asking too many questions, an elderly man whose children had stopped speaking to him after he expressed doubts about church leadership. Each carried their own story of rejection, their own burden of loss, their own fragile hope for something better. As evening approached, they gathered around a fire pit Rowena had constructed where the old porch used to be. The flames danced against the darkening sky while conversations flowed, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as people realized they could speak freely without fear of judgment or retribution. "I used to think faith meant never questioning anything," Marcus said, bouncing his baby daughter gently. "But watching what they wanted to do to Elena, forcing her into something that felt wrong to both of us, I realized that blind obedience isn't faith at all." The elderly man, who had introduced himself as Brother Peterson, nodded slowly. "I spent 60 years following every rule, accepting every teaching without question. It wasn't until I found my own granddaughter crying in her bedroom, terrified of disappointing God, that I understood how fear had poisoned everything I thought was sacred." Rowena listened to each story, seeing her own journey reflected in their words. The crushing weight of certainty giving way to the lighter but more challenging burden of seeking truth for oneself. The loneliness of exile gradually replaced by the deeper connection that came from authentic community. "My great-aunt left me something," Rowena said when the conversation lulled. She disappeared into the cabin and returned with Miriam's final journal, the one she had found just last week, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She wrote this shortly before she died. She read aloud by firelight, "Those who seek to control others through fear will always claim to speak for God. But the divine voice I hear speaks of love, of questions that lead to growth, of communities built on compassion rather than compliance. I pray that someday someone will understand that the greatest act of faith is trusting ourselves to seek truth, even when that truth leads us away from everything we once believed." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled desert sky. Elena was crying quietly, but when Rowena looked closer, she realized they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "What happens now?" the teenager asked. His name was David, and he had been living in his car for 2 weeks before Sarah found him. Rowena looked around the circle at these faces, illuminated by firelight, people who had lost everything they thought they needed, and were slowly discovering what they actually did need. "We figure it out together," she said. "We build something new, not a church with rules and hierarchies, but a community based on mutual support and the freedom to seek our own understanding of what's sacred." Over the following months, word spread quietly through underground networks of doubters and questioners. The Haven became a way station for those in transition, a place where people could heal from spiritual trauma and discover their own paths forward. Some stayed for weeks, others for just a few days, all left with something they hadn't arrived with, the knowledge that they were not alone in their journey. Rowena often stood in the doorway of the cabin at sunset, watching the desert transform in the changing light. She thought of Miriam, of all the others who had passed through this place seeking refuge. The exile that had once felt like an ending had become the beginning of something far more meaningful than anything she had lost. The questions that had once terrified her now felt like gifts, invitations to a deeper, more honest relationship with mystery itself.